Hello everyone, good evening, welcome to Trolley Logic. It's the 19th of October 2013, 7pm in the UK, 2pm Eastern Time in the States. As always, we're a weekly kind of skeptical, secular, atheist, whatever kind of show. And you are all welcome to call in later on. Just simply add the Skype contact Trolley Logic and give me a little PM with a very basic gist of your question, where you're at, and we'll add you into the call in due course. Please just don't call my contact details, it just gets distracting, and just be patient, we will add you. Also, please put on headphones if you can, and mute your stream when you do get through. Also on that note, when you do call in, you do grant us permission to use your likeness for uploading the show later, so please no funny stuff with DMCAs afterwards. And another legal notice, this show and its recording is public domain, so feel free to share any clips or the whole thing. Just be sure to link us back as a nice little courtesy. And I think that's all the usual disclaimers out the way. I'll get round to introducing the panel, and as always, Marty, welcome.
Hi everyone.
And welcoming back again, Lundy.
Good to be here, everybody.
And I suppose we'll just go straight into it. You can introduce our very special guest for us. I'll take it away, Lundy.
All right, everybody. Our guest tonight is Robert Johson. He's a practical ethicist and philosopher of science. He's graduated in philosophy from the University of Aberdeen, specializing in the intersection of morality and rationality. He also is a staunch advocate of science and evidence-based endeavors. His other interests in work lie primarily in animal ethics, where he's written numerous articles on animal welfare, animal rights, and the irrationality within both, while standing up for non-human interests from a rational perspective. He currently resides in Aberdeen with his partner and their adopted cat, Riley. Welcome, Robert. It's great to have you on the show.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me on.
So we asked Robert to be on, in part just because we like having intelligent people to interview who have written books and all that kind of stuff. But there's also a book out right now that you all should probably go see, and it's called Irrational Morality. Zulu's holding it up right now. Irrational Morality is a book written by Robert Johson. It's kind of, would it be fair to say that this would be a sort of an aid to Sam Harris's moral landscape, like something to read right afterwards?
Well, it kind of follows from it in a sense. I mean, the ideas in Sam Harris's work, certainly something that prompted the ideas in my own. The arrogant part of me would like to think adds to his work. The more cautious part of me would like to think, read it afterwards.
Well, the only reason I say that is just because the sheer amount of times that you reference Harris, at least in the beginning, prior to going into the bulk of the book, there a lot of times you say, well, here's where he got some things right, here's where he got some things wrong. I'm going to try and fix his mistakes, and then we're going to move on from here and try to create an actual, like, very well grounded framework for what I suppose we would call objective morality. Something that I just like in general about the book is the fact that it is very academically written, not so much that it's overtly technical and your average person can't pick it up and look at it and understand it. But it's just that you start off with chapters explaining all the problems that you're going to address first, and then in each chapter you kind of put down these premises that you're going to devote the rest of the chapter to defending. And then each section is one of the premises that you outlined in the beginning. It's very much like what something would write when they're in college. And I'm just wondering, like, are you aware you're not in university anymore? Are you aware that this is a popular book?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, what I was trying to do is I suppose, the massive influences in terms of other books would be for things like Ben Goldacre books or something that gets into the public domain, but still manages to keep some resemblance of academic use, or add something to the area or something people can learn from. But yeah, it's a very difficult line to tread, I suppose, trying to put across new ideas as well as trying to explain old ones, and also do something that people actually want to read and not just the people that already agree with you.
That's true. I mean, that's one of the strengths to outlining the problems in the beginning, because you'll have people who pick up this book and just see the title and go, "Oh, now this sounds like something I'm not going to like at all." And in the beginning, you simply say, "Here are all the problems that I know you already have with my position, and I'm going to tell you them right now, and then I'm going to address them." One of the first things that I highlighted when I was reading the book was a very curious statement that I found. It was under the section "Finding an Ought." The paragraph starts off with, "However, human society has gone well beyond naturally existing situations. Thus, quite simply, we solve the is-ought problem if we can identify a societal situation in which an ought can be logically derived." Now later on, the end of the paragraph says, "A collective foundational agreement allows for a collective objective form of morality." Now, I reading on, you kind of understand what exactly you were saying. But when I first read it, it kind of gave off a sort of feeling that you were saying intersubjective consensus is, if not the same, at least in some ways equivalent to objective. But later on, clear that you're not saying that. You're saying that it simply allows for a pathway to get to that, which is a lot better, I think, because I almost had issues.
Well, because the first point was to try and make the point that a lot of people, maybe I'm reading the wrong ethics books, but a lot of ethics books try and make out that there simply is objective ethics and they exist, and almost like you would read in a physics book, people are talking about physics or scientific facts existing in the natural world, and that seems like an obviously flawed proposal. Moral facts don't really exist in the same way. So the first point was to make that clear. The second point is to say, well, if we want to have a moral code, all we have to do is collectively agree to it, really. It's a societal thing. It doesn't mean that these facts that we're coming across are facts in the same way that facts in physics are facts. It just means that, we can have facts that we all agree on, and we can work from a rational basis for these. It's not so much trying to prove that facts exist as a scientific matter in the very natural sense of the word, I suppose. But, it's also the part you said about subjective, the difference between subjective and objective. I think with morality, you're kind of always open to new ideas, and perhaps in the way that you're not in other forms of academia as well, because the facts aren't so obvious. The evidence isn't so staunch, in a sense. You're always going off societal agreement. Unless you always have to be open to everything, and you always have to listen to everything, well, within reason. So yeah, it's a complicated one.
Oh yeah, the entire subject of ethics is a very complicated one. It's why it's been debated for millennia. Anyway, one of the next things that I outlined, going on a little bit further into the book. It was a section entitled "Why Does Rational Morality Need to Be Objective or Science-Based?" And I'm at the paragraph. It starts off, "So we are rationally justified in going above relativism and creating something objective. But in order for it to be truly objective, it needs to be a part of a collective method that strives for objectivity. And the only human method that does this in any meaningful way is organized science." And what I highlighted was, once as described in the first two steps, we have a foundation for a theory, a societally agreed upon one. We simply need to throw one scientific assumption in that we ought to be rational. Now, that seems very controversial to me. Now, I agree with you. It's just that very often when I bring it up, it seems that people are very dissatisfied with that assumption. Like, you can't just assume that ought. We have to justify that through something else. What would you say?
I think so. Yeah, they ought to be rational, though. I mean, I do go on later in the book to do something which I think a lot of other philosophers of science do, which is show that they ought to be rational and kind of proves itself in a very circular way, but in a way that's very important, and in a way that no other ought is really proved. And ought to be rational, once you really dissect it and get deep into the philosophy of it, you can't really make any argument without supposing that you ought to be rational about it. Like, the points in the book I make like this are the there's the feminist critique, the postmodern feminist critique, which says that rationality is a patriarchal concept. I think a lot of science philosophers or people interested in science will have heard this a fair amount, making the point that, while trying to make the point that science is patriarchal for various reasons and all kinds of nonsense around that subject.
Yeah, even presuming that were true, it just seems rather silly to me to just kind of discount it entirely because it comes from what one might perceive as a patriarchal society. That seems kind of silly to me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the points that are made really the entire criticism ignores the idea of what science is. It's really saying that the institution of science, or how it developed, or how it's run, might be patriarchal, and it might well be true that some areas of science are run by sexist people or something, or influenced by patriarchy in some way, or do some harm to women. But that does not mean that neutral scientific method is therefore harmful to any class of people. Obviously, being as objective as we can about finding truth is not necessarily prejudice to anyone, and in fact it's the only guide to being non-prejudice. You have to be completely objective about any given subject to find the correct thing to do in that situation. So to say it's at all prejudice would be almost contradictory to what prejudice means, in a sense.
One of the very first things that you go through in the book is the religious sort of justifications for objective morality, and it's funny to me because your description of what it is and where we're currently heading as a society, as human beings in general, is that it's just becoming increasingly more irrelevant to people at large, and just people in general just aren't really accepting of it. Even if you are religious, you tend just to shy away from religious morality and go towards secular morality. And it seems to me that you're sort of predicting a future where almost nobody even references their religion in reference to morality anymore. Would that be an accurate portrayal?
Well, I hope so. I think we're getting there gradually. I mean, at least in the UK, I know in the US there's still, every time there's an election, there's a strong focus on religion, but so it's hard to get that out of politics. And if it's hard to get out of politics, that probably means it's not out of people's moral views or ethical views. But the idea being really that at the bottom of it, it doesn't actually matter if you have religious beliefs or not on that subject. The main thing is that when you're dealing with other people or other individuals of any species even, don't let your religion influence that. Go by the secular facts we know about the situation, rather than what your personal or spiritual or completely deluded beliefs are.
Right. I mean, it's kind of ineffective when you reference your religion when you're talking to somebody who doesn't share your religion to try and say what is right and what is wrong. I mean, it's sort of like if any moral realist were to make a presumption as to what morality is when we're talking about it, and somebody fundamentally disagrees with that already, well, we're just not going to be able to communicate very well in the first place.
No, I mean, you're starting from a different foundation, and you're trying to get to a shared result. It's like starting an equation without sharing the same propositions. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. No.
Martimer, you said you have a question?
Yeah. You mentioned, or was it Lundy who mentioned that when someone picks up the book and just sees the title, Rational Morality, they go, this is something that I have no interest in, or I already know that I'm going to disagree with it. And that sort of brought up the question, does anyone subscribe to irrational morality then? Or are people saying that it's better to be irrational?
Well, actually, there's I know we weren't going to go into the history of things, but there actually is a very long history of people who are against being rational. I think one of the most prominent examples in semi-recent history, I mean, it's still hundreds of years ago, but Martin Luther was a big advocate that we need to not be rational when it comes to, at the very least, certain things like what religion proposes. That we need to pretty much just throw it away. It has no place here. We need to completely abandon it, and that is something that is maybe not around the world. It's very prevalent, but in the United States, you will get that a lot of people saying, "Oh, you people trying to rationalize everything away. You can't do that when it comes to some things. Some things just ain't rational, and you gotta deal with it." That stuff does happen a decent amount, but in the book, when you actually pick it up and start reading it, Mr. Johson really addresses that from the outset. He goes, listen, even if you disagree with me, even if you completely disagree with the premise of this book right from the onset, just abandon that for now and just listen to the facts and then make a decision afterwards. Just that's all he asks you to do, and I think it's a very good way to address that issue.
Yeah, but
yeah, I think also as well as people.
My experience has been that people who are irrational believe they're rational anyway. So this seems a bit weird to me.
Yeah, no, well, I that's the point I was going to make, actually. I mean, people, it's probably more the stigma of the world. I don't think it'll be people reading it thinking, I am irrational about morality so much. I mean, there surely will be people like that, but I think the main is just people will assume that the rational in that title means scientific or something, and thereby it's either not a very interesting account of morality where someone tries to draw moral facts from the colour of rocks, it draws how we should treat rocks or something ridiculous like that, or else they see it as just a bit boring. And I suppose those are the two things that you need to try to counteract when you write a book like that.
Yeah, they probably would assume that we're talking about scientific rationality, especially since the subtitle is A Science of Right and Wrong. Oh. So that would most likely be the thing that turns a lot of people off. But to be honest, when just reading through the book, just because of the way it's written, where the problems are stated from the onset, and then the solutions to the problems are immediately proposed afterwards, and then how to justify the solutions to the problems are very well outlined throughout the rest of the book. It's very easy to read. It's very easy to pick up. It's just so well written that I think that a lot of people, even if you disagree from the onset, there's a lot of thought-provoking passages in here. I mean, Mr. Johson will address the criticism that scientists themselves aren't really rational. A more fulfilling way might translate to people cannot be perfectly rational, which is fine. It's not a problem for rational morality, though. It's more of a problem for just sort of rule utilitarianism of people always trying to rationalize everything about their morality. And I'm talking too much about your book to you, but one of the things you address in the book is the notion that emotions, when used in sort of value judgments and all these things, can also be rational, which is interesting to me because I always remember it being said to me that emotions are patently irrational because of the simple nature of what they are. Would you mind explaining what you mean by emotions can be rational?
Yeah, I mean, that's a discussion I had with a friend of mine just that was coming out. It's important to clarify what that sentence means, because you can kind of use it two ways. One way would be to say that emotions themselves are markers of what a truth about a subject is, which is probably not true in any case.
No.
An emotion is a reaction to something. It's not going to judge a truth. I mean, that's a very spiritual account of the world, might believe that. But, in my case, the reason I said that is that people think that if you're advocating for a rational form of morality or rational form of moral advocacy of any kind, they think that suddenly you should keep emotion completely out of it. And that might quite be a good idea, to be honest. In some areas, you don't really want people to be guilted into things. You'd rather, well, I would hope that we would rather they understood the area and then made a valued decision on it, a rational decision on it to help in that subject, rather than be, emotionally guilted into it. But at the same time, emotions are rational reactions. It would be we wouldn't want to say that someone was reacting rationally to witnessing a murder, a horrific murder in front of their eyes, if they didn't feel something, if they just saw it rationally and said, "Oh, there's nothing I could have done about it. It's fine. I'll ignore it." We wouldn't say they were acting particularly rationally, because we want people to be. We want people to have emotions or feel emotions. It's part of what makes a society work. So it's only really rational in the sense that they can be rational reactions, which itself is a whole other subject that we can talk about all night probably. But
and then there are things like if there's a T-Rex chasing you, then it's pretty rational to run because you're afraid
and be fearful.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's not. It doesn't mean that running means that the T-Rex is evil, which is what many spiritual accounts and morality which I've come across say. But it does mean that, you know, perhaps you're doing the right thing by running, and thereby it's an emotional reaction. Yeah.
A while back, we actually interviewed another guy named Massimo Pigliucci. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he wrote another book very similar about morality. Not really in one way advocating one morality over another, just sort of analyzing not just the history of morality, but also modern times, what it is that people seem to be thinking about when they're talking about morality. And one of the sections of his book actually goes over a study that showed that not just the trolley experiment, where people, when it comes to pulling the lever, they'd rather pull the lever rather than push the fat guy. If you, I'm sure you know that experiment quite well, actually. But why that is the case, and it seems to be the case that we sort of revert ethics depending on situation. In one case, we'll go utilitarianism, and then another way we'll just go Kantian, just completely different. And there seems to be a sort of formula that goes on in someone's brain when that happens. Now, what would your perception of that be, of people just kind of switching how they evaluate a situation based off of what they would have to do to rectify it?
How do you mean? Like the kind of how we naturally view a situation as a marker for whether that's truly the right decision or not, or?
Sort of. I mean, you're aware of the trolley experiment. You know, 5 people are on the tracks. There's a trolley coming. You can pull a lever and it'll divert it, and it'll only kill one person. Or you can, in the second experiment, push a fat guy and it'll stop the trolley and save the 5 people, but you kill the fat guy. And people prefer to pull the lever, while when it comes to the fat guy, they say, I'm not going to do that. That seems wrong. Why would you suppose that would be the case?
Well, why would they not rather? Why would they rather not intervene? They'd rather actively not intervene than actively intervene, even though they knew it was going to be the wrong utilitarian calculation in their head or whatnot. Right. Yeah, well, I guess that's a natural way to come across it. I suppose you don't want to be blamed for something. I suppose the way morality was formed in most societies, we use laws and moral codes and stigma as punishment for certain acts. So by introducing, when you say, when you immediately introduce the option of acting in some way, then that person becomes to blame for something, whereas they feel not to blame if they're not doing anything. So it's a lot easier for that person to kind of watch something bad happen at the expense of ignoring something less bad that they could have done to alleviate the danger or whatnot. But even if it's the wrong decision, that's it's just the way they're brought up. I would guess that it's just easier because they believe that they're not going to be punished if they're not doing anything, I guess. But that would be my guess. I don't know. I suppose it's a really complicated thing about how we view morality, and in a sense how our brains evolved to view it, I suppose, as well as how we were brought up to view it.
Andy?
Sorry about that. I was actually muted. It's a little perplexing, actually. Moving on a little bit here. Whenever I have an argument with somebody, generally I have this argument with other atheists because it's strange that when people are atheists, by and large, they're far more willing to accept a more relativistic or subjective type of morality rather than an objective type. So I usually have an argument with them because I'm a moral realist. And one of the things they usually bring up is, well, if morality is objective, then you should be able to have an entire list of all the things that are objectively right and wrong. And it seems to me that that's simply born out of not understanding what exactly is being talked about. Because, I mean, and every moral realist that I've read, at the very least, completely understands that situations can change what would be considered right or wrong. Do you think that perhaps if people simply understood what was being argued about a little bit better, that perhaps the arguments that they give against a position would be a little more refined, a little more informed about what they should respond with? I don't think that it would, that education alone as to the subject matter would turn everybody into a moral realist, but at the very least, they would understand a little bit better what it is they're arguing against, because it seems by and large they just don't.
Yeah, I would like to think so. I think, to be honest, there's something valuable in the reality having. You know, it's you thinking critically about it in the first place, and when you say something on the issue of morality that they're saying, they're coming up with a reason why that can't possibly be true or whatnot is useful. At least they're coming up with an idea. But if the more they learn about a subject, the better it's going to be. I think that's true for anything. I think there's a lot of people who argue against science on the grounds that, you know, it should know everything and it shouldn't have to keep changing all the time. It's just they're not grasping how the scientific method works, which it would be great if they did. Part of me thinks maybe it's not that they don't know. It's that they don't want to know, or they don't want to accept that, or the way they live their lives doesn't accept that, so they keep it buried in the back of their mind, who knows. But yeah, I'd certainly like to think that the more people know, the better conversations would be, for sure.
All right. Sorry, what was that?
I thought you were muted for a second there, so carry on.
No, I generally mute when I'm not talking.
There is... if you look in the chat here, Lundy, there is a question that came in a while ago. Shangori, if you want to take that one.
Oh, geez. I just logged into the chat, so I can't see it.
Oh, no, it's in the Skype chat. Sorry.
Oh, it's in the Skype chat.
Yeah.
There we go. What are the arguments why science would be patriarchal? This seems like a strange point. To some people who don't delve into the subject as often as perhaps you and I do, that does seem like a very alien thing, like out of nowhere. Would you mind explaining generally what the argument is in that sense?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a huge subject. Well, a lot of sociologists, to be honest, bring this point up. Primarily, I suppose the main argument is that science was mainly developed by men, is mainly the people in power in scientific institutions are men. So the idea is that the fact that more women don't go into science means it's a patriarchal system, it's keeping women out, things like this. I mean, they're all decent enough points. You know, we do need for science to be more inclusive. We do need for women to be encouraged into science more. But the main point that sociologists of this persuasion like to make is that rationality, or science itself, is patriarchal, which is the point that the method itself is patriarchal, which the proof they use is that there aren't more women in the sciences, and, you know, it wasn't developed by women and men equally or whatnot, which obviously is a very flawed point, because all science is trying to be as neutral as possible. It's not a set of methods. Necessarily, it's what works, it's what finds out the truth, it's what's testable, it's what creates evidence, what tests evidence, and that develops as well. As soon as we can show a test to be wrong, or a method within science to be wrong, it's discarded. As soon as we can show a new one to work, it's taken on board. So the idea that scientific method is flawed just by testing things, or just by needing evidence to believe things, thinking that whole thing of neutrality and objectivity is patriarchal whatsoever. But you know, a lot of arguments don't have to make sense nowadays, it seems. So.
It does. I mean, just reading about that, reading about how science hasn't been developed equally by both men and women. Not only does that seem to rather disregard what science is all about in the first place, but it also disregards a lot of the contributions that women have, in fact, made to like modern day technology and science and everything that we currently have. It's just weird to consider it patriarchal when you have successful females in the quote unquote business of science in the first place. I don't know. I guess we're all in agreement that it seems rather silly and doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So that's something.
Yeah.
We have another question from the audience. Mickey Mauser is asking, using your proposition of rational morality, how could we answer the question of whether or not it's right to reward a student at school financially for good grades? Like if somebody got an A, you would give them money. If they got worse grades, then you wouldn't. Would that be a good thing to do? Would that be a wrong thing to do? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a complex one, isn't it? I mean, you'd have to do an entire study. It would be a bit, perhaps quite silly for me to put an answer to it when I haven't looked at the pros and cons. But I mean, at a very basic level, you'd have to judge as to, you know, what the conclusion of doing either would be. What evidence do we have that it would work? And what evidence do we have of what other effects it would have? You know, it's a fair enough proposition. It's not certainly not something we should ignore. I mean, a lot of people's ideas about morality are based on a very, like we talked about earlier, a very natural reaction to a situation. So people might think, oh, goodness, paying people to go to school. I wasn't paid to go to school. We shouldn't do that. That seems wrong. But, you know, of course, that's not how we should really be judging morality. We should be judging it based on the effect it has. I mean, perhaps one of those effects is how people feel about it, whether it makes them feel like their own schooling was unfair and pointless, or whether society's dumbing down or whatnot. But really, it should be a decision based on the effects. So I suppose the answer is, who knows? Maybe it's a good idea.
Perhaps it is. Perhaps it isn't. The whole point.
Indeed, let's be philosophers about this.
The whole point, from what I got anyway from the book so far, is that if we're going to evaluate a situation and say whether or not something is right or wrong, we do require some level of scientific understanding of the situation to know exactly what all the effects are in order to say whether or not it is right or wrong. So if it is something that we haven't addressed yet in any sort of double-blind test, or at the very least statistically, it doesn't seem to be something that we have enough information to weigh in on. If that's correct.
Yeah. I think we always need the evidence. Now,
what would you do? How would you use this rational morality when, if somebody were to come up to you and tell you, perhaps, I don't know, homosexuality is evil, the Bible says so, blah blah blah, all that usual stuff that you tend to get in that argument, at least over here. If somebody were to come up to you with that, how would you employ a rational morality sort of argument, however you would end up addressing that?
Well, firstly, I mean, over here, no one really says that. Well, not to me. I don't know whether they just know not to. No one ever really says homosexuality is wrong, but I know in some parts of the world it's a massive stigma attached and whatnot. So even in many developed countries. So I mean, it's certainly a question worth looking at. But I mean, for me personally, I mean, I've obviously the theory isn't about coming up with the best way to speak to people about ethics. Hopefully, it can help educate people on that, but. I mean, personally, I try to stay away from emotive arguments. As an example, I use in the book of how in the US, when gay marriage is discussed, it tends to be two sides using myths, essentially. Obviously, a lot more on the conservative side of things, tending to use arguments about God or about homosexuality being unnatural and all kinds of other largely irrelevant points about it, which tend to sway people. So I tend to stay away from arguments that, aren't rational. You could argue that it's okay to use an argument which is not technically true, I suppose. You could argue the merits of saying something about a subject when it's not true to get the right result from that person's thinking. Ethically questionable, perhaps, but largely I think just sticking to the facts is the best way to do things, and even being sympathetic to the position, perhaps, and not immediately judgmental of it. But yeah, it's one of those questions that obviously raises passion still, so certainly something that is worth looking into if it does come up a lot,
especially over here in the States. I mean, there is a bit of a cultural line where we'll address issues that most European countries have already addressed and done away with at this point, for the most part, at the very least. I think, and this is something purely from my experience that I'm drawing upon from here. I think there was the reason why a lot of the civil rights issues that we're going through right now have already been gone through and done away with for the most part in other countries, is simply because one, we're a very large country and we're also a democratic country. I mean, those things kind of really play a huge part in how long it takes to get an issue out and dealt with, because everyone's opinion matters in every single way. And it doesn't matter how extreme your opinion is, it's still going to get heard. In fact, the more extreme, probably the more likely it will get heard. And that sort of perpetuates itself within such a very large country. But to be honest, I mean, you said it before, like, generally when people bring up this argument, they usually bring up completely irrelevant points as to whether or not it's natural, whether or not the Bible agrees with it, all these different things that don't really matter as far as the argument goes, but they're still brought up over and over and over again. It's a very toxic issue for some people that there's very little understanding as to how exactly we should approach those who disagree with us about it. We currently have a caller. Sir Strife is now on the call. Welcome, Sir Strife. Do you have a question?
Give me a second. I'm lagging.
Alrighty.
Well, I heard what you said earlier about the whole civil rights thing in the United States. They, like the civil rights laws that in other countries in Europe they've done away with and stuff. Would you agree it's possibly because of our systems of politics and stuff, and because of our diversity and?
Well, yeah, that's kind of what I meant when I said that we live in a democratic country, and when everyone's opinion matters, and you have a large country with a large population, it's a lot harder to address an issue and do something about it. Mainly because, again, everyone's opinion matters. We have a very diverse nation of everyone who has differing opinions on things. But that's actually one of the things that I think is a strong point in favor of leaning towards viewing morality as this objective thing, because it tends to be a lot easier to address an issue when it's something that can be objectively evaluated, rather than simply taking everyone's opinion into account. And
You mean instead of morality being a more naturalistic morality, you mean just assume it's objective? No,
naturalistic morality and objective morality aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. But if we were to view it as something that is more objective than perhaps relativistic, then issues become a lot easier to address, at the very least, because we don't have to take everyone's opinion into account, because we can, under that system, say, well, some people's opinions are wrong about this. Not just that we disagree with you, but you are in fact actually wrong about what you're saying about whatever the issue is, makes addressing it a lot easier rather than just saying, well, you have your opinion, I have my opinion, I think you're wrong, and you think I'm wrong, and where are we going to go from there? It's very difficult.
What if, for example, the side that you say is wrong have the majority, or can influence the majority and make them think it's right?
Well, two things about that. One, it's a good thing that we live in not a pure democracy, but a democratic republic, specifically made the way it is to prevent mob rule, majority rule, all that kind of stuff. And the other thing is that if we were to view morality as purely relativistic, to the point that I don't even think a lot of subjectivists really go, if we were to view it as purely relativistic, purely subjectivist, and whoever has the majority opinion or the most power automatically is then right, if we were to view it that way, then if you were to get everyone to agree, most people to agree with you about something that perhaps someone else would think is wrong, then that someone else is rather out of luck in that department. But if we view it as a more objective basis, then it wouldn't matter how many people disagreed because they'd still be wrong. Not necessarily in the sense of scientific matters, like so many people who think that the world is 5 to 6
public matters don't really matter in science that much. Pretty much is what scientists say really matters in that department.
Well, they don't matter as far as physics go.
Well, yeah.
Or geology or biology or all these different things. But there are some soft sciences that, at the very least, that do address public issues like sociology, psychology, and they'll be able to, at the very least, provide data that can help us weigh in on a situation. And I think that's actually something that's gone over in Mr. Johnson's book. By the way, Mr. Johnson, do you have anything that you want to add to this?
Yeah, the only point I would add is that bringing also into it the idea that we shouldn't really have religion in government as well. Obviously, that if you have a constitution or a set of laws that assumes and makes the point that religion shouldn't play a part in government, then suddenly you pass that down to the people that when we're making decisions like this, we don't listen to religion, we listen to evidence. That's how we make decisions here. And then once you do that, it's very difficult to have people campaigning on these points without being able to back them up with evidence. Like it'll be very strange in the UK to see even the Conservative Prime Minister saying anything really strongly worded about religion. I mean, I don't know to what extent that happens in the US, to be honest, and once we get into serious political debate, but it would be very strange to see it here that he would make a point completely backed by religion. He might reference religious people, or he might say the word God or something. He's not going to be referencing the fact that God thinks this is the case, so we must do it or whatnot. And it's very important to keep that out of politics.
Well, I mean, the difference with the British political system and the American is, I mean, you still got parties, of course, but you have a parliament and where parties can actually kind of have a conversation, while in the United States, it's pretty much by whoever the hell holds the majority and stuff. I mean, in the House of Reps and Senate's by each state has 2, but still. Which would be kind of nice if they did have some kind of like forum, which Parliament serves in Britain, right?
Yeah, I mean the Parliament in Britain, it's not always the best for speaking to each other. I mean, primarily you just see people when there's anyone of any importance in the Parliament, it mainly seems that they throw insults at each other and demean each other. But apart from that, they do communicate, at least, I suppose.
Well, it's just like C-SPAM, I guess.
We've no idea what that is.
You don't know what C-SPAN is? Oh, well.
Don't they have videos of Parliament and stuff? Like
we've got BBC Parliament here.
Yeah, that's pretty much
just like that.
All right, okay.
That's pretty much C-SPAN.
So basically a channel that no one's going to watch.
Kind of.
Do watch it.
Kind of.
But,
There's plenty of people who do watch it, mainly because I don't know what it is about our politicians, but I think they all realize that they're like being recorded, so they're a lot more showy. They really do try to give these emotional speeches. They really do try to do whatever possible to just garner as much attention. So I think we probably, I haven't looked at this, so I can't say for sure. I think we probably do get more attention to C-SPAN than perhaps BBC Parliament would be, if only because our politicians are all like, they're refining their art into a form of acting.
I mean, the thing that I've
Yeah,
noticed with
they're
American...
kind of doing wrestling promos or something like
Little
that.
bit.
Yeah, American politics is more almost like to the part of celebrity death matches and stuff because of the fact that in Britain, I mean, you guys care about your politicians, but in our case, we like look at them as like, look at what Anthony Weiner did. Like, like the whole, like, like it's like a celebrity kind of thing, I guess. That follows him forever.
Yeah. I think the best way to put it is in the UK, we all hate our politicians and we just go for the one who's the least scumbaggish, basically. That's how we go about it. I think that's the only way I can sum it up, how we approach politics here.
How do they approach politics in Sweden?
Yeah, that usually no one cares, and then it's election time, and then it's basically to. We have a lot of parties to choose between, but basically they always form alliances. So you basically end up with two choices, and there's really no difference between them anyway.
That pretty much sums up most American politics, to be honest. The majority of people don't care very often about what's going on until an election comes along. And not even congressional elections, really. It's more just the presidential elections. They just don't. And we're going like...
The politics are far more reasonable, I'll say. And they seem to represent the better than in America. At least that's my impression.
Well, to be
I mean, for one, in America, you're only allowed to choose between the options that are available. But in Sweden, you can vote for any party, even if they're not.
I mean, you could vote
and
for
it
any
actually matters.
Oh
well, no, it does matter. It does matter. This is like completely off topic, so I'm going to go ask questions more on topic after I address this. But it does matter when we vote for third parties. It does in fact actually impact the political structure, because the thing is, every politician wants votes. So what they do is they see who people are voting for and why, and try to incorporate that into their politics so that they can then garner those people's votes in the future. So if a bunch of people, for instance, vote Green, then generally it's the Democrats who would look at the Green Party and say, what are they saying that seems to be a good idea that's attracting people? How can we incorporate that into our platform so that we can get more Green voters?
Yeah. Also, it's kind of a bad thing if third parties get votes because they're drawing away from the two major parties, and so it could cause a little bit of a shift in power, I guess.
Which has happened a few times.
Yes.
Back on the topic of rational morality and all that kind of stuff. We had a question a little while ago from Shangori in the audience, asking Mr. Johson, why, in your thoughts, do people in a religious context not think morality can be decided on a rational basis, in the sense of why force a supernatural state to decide, while to us it's so easy to see. Why impose the supernatural to decide what is moral, while to other people it seems rather easy to see why any one thing can be right or wrong?
Well, I mean, some people genuinely believe that there is a supernatural state of things. So, I mean, that's obviously why they think that we should be doing things in that sense. I mean, if it turned out, if we all woke up tomorrow and God had announced himself, or we all knew inherently that God existed, and we certainly never appeared on this podcast again, we would all, it would be stupid of us not to start taking on board this supernatural way of viewing morality, or way of living entirely. It just so happens that that's not true. So it'd be best to keep it out of the picture when we're discussing anything of any meaning. And most of us would like to think that morality has some sort of meaning, 'cause it's about how we treat each other, and it directly impacts on how we each live and how everyone else lives as well.
When speaking about morality, one of the things I like to ask people, because just the general assumption that when we're talking about morality, we seem to inherently be talking about the well-being of conscious creatures. You go over that in the book. It seems like a good start-off point. It seems like a good definition. If there's a better one, then that's great. But it seems to be what we're based off of. I usually ask people, because they don't like that. They don't like when we define morality, at least not the people who disagree with perhaps the more realist position. When we define morality, they say, oh, that's just subjective. But then I just ask them, well, can you give me an instance of something that is morally substantial in some way that does not have to do with the well-being of conscious creatures? And generally, they don't have an answer to that that's, sufficient. How else would we determine that that's a good enough definition, at least for now, to work off of as far as morality goes?
Well, can't you deem something as not
conscious? Well, firstly, I mean, I've heard quite a few people actually on that same subject come up with answers. It's normally that plants have feelings too. I don't know if you ever work in the area of animal ethics, but that one comes up quite a lot. It's not a great argument.
Actually, I'll just let you know now, I'm currently an ethical vegan. So I do deal with these arguments a lot. I don't tend to accept that plants have feelings too, because to me, feelings seem to be
you need
involved.
A brain, right?
Well, some sort of reactionary, nervous system of some sort that plants don't have access to.
You don't even have a nervous system.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That's you can't. It's a bad argument, really. There's no evidence for it. I mean, that's how science works. You need evidence, but if there's a lack of evidence, you don't accept the proposition as a fact. We can't accept the proposition that plants have feelings too, because there doesn't seem to be any logic behind it. It's bizarre. It's like saying, the sky has feelings too. It doesn't make any sense. Just because it's an organic object and other things that have feelings are organic objects, that's not good enough logic to prove the point. What was the second part of the question that we had?
The second part of the question, I believe we're on the same question that Shangori asked originally. Was it? Why is it the case that people, those who rely on a religious morality, why do they seem to need to incorporate a God to make a moral decision? Whereas to the most of us, it seems rather obvious what is right and wrong.
Yeah, that's the one we kind of talked about, isn't it? I mean, it's going to be a personal difference, and people want to believe what they want to believe. At the end of the day, I guess it'll take some amount of study to figure out why everyone believes what they do or says what they say they believe, whether they believe it or not. But yeah, I mean, we're back to the earlier point as well of education. People need to be coming from a solid foundation of everyone having the same education and valuing the same level of critical thinking or truth-finding skills that everyone else has, rather than just relying on personal beliefs of what's important and what's not important.
We had another question. Earlier you said that if God would just show himself or itself or whatever just immediately and start explaining what morality was. I don't recall you saying exactly this, but according to the questioner, you said it would be silly for us to not agree with their idea of morality if it was God. And the question was, why accept the idea that if God says so, it's moral? If I may, presumably, I would think that if we're talking about a God coming down and talking about morality, we're probably talking about a god, as far as the definition goes, that they're morally perfect. Generally, that's how gods, at the very least the Abrahamic religious gods, tend to be defined when talking about whether or not they're actual things and whether or not they're relevant. And
morally perfect, so they advocate slavery and incest and rape and murder and genocide.
But we can actually look at these things, and if a god were to come down, if a god did exist, and they were morally perfect, I'm fairly certain that they would disagree with all that. And so, fundamentalist Christianity, Islamic theism, Judaism, the things that God purported to say throughout history in those religions, I'm pretty sure are not signs of moral perfection. But if one did exist and it was morally perfect, then it would then follow that they probably know more than we do as to what is right and what is wrong, if they were to exist and have these attributes.
Maybe they would say they were morally acceptable at those stages of human civilization.
Sorry, Mr. Johson, I kind of cut you off there to give my own answer. What did you have something you wanted to say?
No.
All right. Fair enough.
Not on that particular subject.
All right. Let's go ahead and go back to the book. So, from my understanding of normative ethics, at the very least, there's generally three main sort of subject matters at hand, and those tend to be any sort of utilitarianistic ethics or consequentialism, or however anybody wants to view it, deontology, rule. I believe rule utilitarianism actually would be in some ways similar to deontology, and the other one is virtue ethics. Of those three, which ones do you think most match what would probably be a result of viewing morality through a scientific, rational sense?
Okay. Well, it's kind of an interesting one, because I've always tried to stay away. Obviously, like we said at the beginning, the point of the book was to try and stay away from the philosophy. Try and stay away from using philosophical terms, because we want people to understand it from a very real life point of view. Hence why using like the cases in media at the beginning of the book of the Jimmy Savile episodes and things like that. But I mean, I suppose to be pushed, I think maybe rule utilitarianism is obviously gets to some kind of stage that that rational morality can agree with. It's one of those things, though. Again, like the whole point of rational morality is sort of to put their theory in place, to put a foundation there, to go above what Sam Harris has done and build upon. Because obviously the good things he did was to argue on behalf of having science in moral debates and put across a theory of what is morality, and then to build on that and actually provide the foundation to cement those ideas into place. And all the other people who've been saying, obviously Harris wasn't the first, but maybe one of the more well-known. But on top of that, you're leaving the theory open, and that's another thing I try and mention in the book, that these ideas are open to progression. If someone comes up with an idea where, for example, it becomes evident that act utilitarianism is going to be the best way to push forwards, I mean, I don't know what that evidence would entail, but if it came to that point, we'd have to agree, and we'd have to go, yeah, you're right, let's go forward with this and change it towards a more act utilitarian system. But at the moment, I would guess rule utilitarianism comes closest. Well, that is a difficult one, to be honest, to pin it down. Basically, the idea is that whatever holds the most evidence in any given situation, or given any thorough explanation and discussion of the laws in the particular issue we're looking at, is the way forward. So it gets complex again, but yeah, I would say that was the closest one.
So essentially, when we're applying rational morality as it's defined, then in some senses we're almost already applying rule utilitarianism, because we're setting forth a framework by which we kind of talk about it and view it. If the evidence gives this position more credence as to whether or not any one given issue is right or wrong, then it would be rational and right to then accept that position, sort of as a basic rule of discussion. It's kind of what you're saying. Am I completely off on that, or does that sound about right?
Yeah, no, it's kind of on the same kind of area. I mean, yeah, it's basically throwing it open to evidence, which obviously this is not a long book. This is no book, to be honest, is ever going to be long enough to explore and prove which moral theory is going to best suit the well-being of sentient individuals on the entire planet, or perhaps in the entire universe. But given the vast range of events and actions that can occur, but at the same time, yeah, I mean, you're in the right area with that, I think, more or less.
All right, fair enough then. I know we kind of touched on this earlier. The basic crux of rational morality and how we kind of instill it into the public mind, so to speak, is to, at the very least, establish I suppose it could be said it's an axiom, at the very least, as it's worded in the book, is that we ought to be rational. And I'm just curious as to what do we say to someone who says, well, why? Why? If somebody is to the point where they ask why we ought to be rational, what exactly do you say to a person like that?
Well, I mean, it's another one of those difficult ones. It's like any moral theory, you've always got difficulty in getting people to adopt it. The world's quite an apathetic place anyway, so you're always going to have that problem. But I think there's always going to be people even that you can't persuade, obviously. There's people, religious, people who are extremely religious and believe that, what they feel in their hearts is really true, are not going to take on board a theory which says we should treat them based on the evidence available rather than how your infinite truth in your heart tells you should act. But at the same time, I think there's a lot more hope for this, in that if you tell people that, we should be doing what's rational, and if we're wrong, we should change our minds and do the new rational thing that we've just discovered. That's a more honest way of viewing morality. And we come across a lot of ethics that is based on people writing books about, this is what I believe is true, this is true, so go and do it, and if anyone tells you different, that's wrong. Not going for that tactic is a better way of doing things. Going for a more open, scientific way of wording things and scientific way of viewing the world is a more hopeful way of doing it, I think, or at least I hope.
You do a lot of work in animal ethics, and I like to annoy everybody that I know by just being a vegan. That tends to be the way it's viewed. Just the fact that I am one is just exceedingly annoying to a lot of people I know, and that brings me endless amusement. But what would you say is sort of what would be the point in which somebody would, at the very least, not even if they don't necessarily have to become like a vegan or a vegetarian or anything, but what would be sort of a point in which someone should probably accept at the very least that animal rights exist and B are being at the very least somewhat abused? Is there like a point of data that you would point to, or just a way of viewing the entirety of the situation of what animals currently go through, or what would you say?
Well, I mean, maybe it's a cultural thing again, but I can't remember the last time I spoke to someone and they didn't kind of agree that some animals somewhere are treated badly, or that animals deserve some sort of respect at the very least. It seems that everyone now agrees with that. Obviously, it may not have been the case 100 years ago or so, but that's true with a lot of things we now believe are morally contentious. But I mean, the basic point to bring up to anyone is the idea of sentience. That other animals do have sentient lives. Well, those that do are morally important, at least, and perhaps there are animals in the sea, that sponges and whatnot, that do not have sentience. So we shouldn't be too bothered about how they feel, because they don't feel. They don't experience anything. There's nothing within them to experience what happens to them. But in general, sentience is the thing that matters. Like what?
Should we care about what they feel, or should we care about their existence?
Wouldn't those two go hand in hand?
Not really. Because, like some endangered species, why would we care about, for example, keeping samples of old diseases around, even though they've been exterminated? I guess we keep them for their existence, at least.
I don't think there's anything necessarily useful about keeping biological categories around, in the same way that if there was an endangered group of humans or an endangered human tribe somewhere, I don't think there's anything morally obligatory for us that we need to take those humans and put them indoors and keep them living the same life so they're around in 100 years' time, whereas they're naturally dying out. Perhaps there's some disease that's killing them. If they want to stay there, I don't think we're morally obligated to take them away or do whatever we want just to keep a biological category alive or a cultural category alive. And I think that's the same with endangered species and things like that.
I think diseases are being kept mainly for study.
Well, yeah,
I don't think kind of what I meant. There's an intent to actually, we need to preserve this just for the sake of preserving it.
Well, yeah, like that. Like also we have a giant seed vault in Greenland, Iceland and such. So, like, we're keeping all these things without caring about their feelings. I mean, they have no feelings, supposedly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Things that have no sentience. There's nothing wrong with keeping, organisms alive so we can study them and learn from them and perhaps create cures to future diseases and things like that. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, we're only about sentient animals that feel and experience what happens. We have some sort of moral obligation there, just like we're talking to other human beings. Just because human beings are more intelligent, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're a lot more morally useful to us than other animals.
Okay.
We had another question from Shane Gorey. He's asking a lot of questions today. Question is, could you possibly think of any situation in which a rational train of thought couldn't be enough to answer a moral question fully? And if so, if a rational train of thought couldn't answer it, could it ever be answered then?
I think there's a lot of moral questions that we don't really have the evidence or information to answer. The debate I use in the book, and this isn't because I've massively researched it, it's just because it's a debatable topic that we probably don't know what would happen. But I happen to agree with the idea of assisted suicide to some degree, putting in place something where we can help people who want to end their lives in states of disease or mental degradation or whatnot. Seems like a good idea, but at the same time, we don't know for sure that if we do that, we don't know what we're doing, opening the doors legally to allow people to kill other people in ways that they can get around the system by saying, this person wanted to die and whatnot. I mean, obviously, it's my opinion that we can put in place safeguards that it wouldn't be a problem, and that we could allow for this laws to go through and allow for assisted suicide without causing such issues. But, there are lots of moral questions like that where we don't necessarily know what's going to happen. We don't have the evidence that says, it's going to be fine. It's going to be a much better way of doing things if we do this. But, that doesn't mean that the theory's not right or we shouldn't use science and rationality at the end of the day. That just means that we can't know everything right now. And perhaps one day, even still, we're never going to know everything. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't try to know everything, or we shouldn't try and make the best of the decisions that we're making.
I was having a discussion with somebody a couple of weeks ago. Actually, we were talking about animal rights and all that, and he understands that animals, for the most part, at the very least, are sentient creatures. But to him, that doesn't seem to be a sufficient reason to find them morally significant. And his justification for this is that there's a decent amount of technology and clothing and many things that we enjoy in the modern world that are just built upon the broken backs of for instance, slave labor, or at least next to slave labor in China or other countries where we get our products. And he says if those people aren't going to be morally significant for us to not get our new technology, why should I care about other sentient creatures that I eat to survive?
Well, it seems like a very strange argument, doesn't it? The argument is that because other humans are abused or enslaved, that we shouldn't care about animals. Is that right?
Little bit. More so, he's sort of pointing to a demonstration of a lack of empathy for other sentient creatures, and so he's trying to sort of invalidate the necessity of sentience to be something that we find morally significant. He's saying that there are these other sentient creatures that we totally don't value and contribute to their current suffering and almost never think about in the first place. And yet I'm supposed to also care about all these animals that I also almost never think about in the first place, that I just eat.
It seems like a very strange argument. I mean, yeah, it's a strange kind of pro-apathy almost argument. It seems, I don't know, like my eyes, I want to keep my eyes closed to point A, so why on earth would I want to open them to point B? It seems like a really bizarre argument to me, but perhaps I'm not just understanding it quite right.
I think he's pointing out a certain, I guess, hypocrisy. I guess, like, if humans aren't important enough, then what makes animals more important? We should stop eating animals, but shouldn't we also then have to stop buying products from, made in sweatshops or whatnot?
Yeah,
I think
absolutely. I would agree with that. I think there's a lot of human issues that we still need to deal with.
Yeah.
A lot of ethics still focuses around humans, most of it probably. And that's not saying that's wrong, just because we should, choose something different to buy in a supermarket, for instance, or choose a slightly different style of shoe or something. Just because we're doing that doesn't mean we have to ignore the massive injustices in the world that are done to other humans. Far from it. We can do both. That's really important. It's important not to create a hierarchy where, well, we'll help them first. Once all human poverty and sufferings are eradicated, we'll do primates next, and then after that we'll help a couple of lions in Africa, and then it's just a bizarre way of doing things. Just, changing your decision in a shop or something is not going to have a massive influence on how much you can do to end sweatshop labor in China or whatnot,
Yeah.
One of the other things that we talked about, because he kept kind of hammering on as to the insignificance as far as he sees of sentience in other species, because it was kind of an intersecting argument, because we were also talking about what philosophy is and what it can generally be considered as. And I'm currently of the position that if you broaden the definition of philosophy enough, then you can technically say that most animals actually have some form of philosophy that they use themselves. And his response to that was that it's just patently absurd, because he can completely and totally disregard them with almost little to no consequences whatsoever. I think he brought up, he's like, I just ate a chicken just like 20 minutes ago. Clearly that chicken's philosophy fails, because I was able to just eat it without anybody stopping me whatsoever. I'm like, well, yeah, you can disregard anyone's philosophy as much as you want, and many times you won't have any repercussions for it, but that doesn't mean that you haven't done that. I think the fact that you disregarded it at the very least implies that there was something to disregard in the first place.
Yeah, I think I kind of see the point. I don't know if I'd quite agree with saying animals have kind of their own philosophies. I guess we like to think they're important and we have all this philosophy and thought and fine art and stuff, but I guess deep down it's all instinct in the same way that animals have instincts. It's just we're building more on it and doing more sophisticated ways with it, or we'd like to think. But yeah, I don't know if I'd say all animals have a philosophy as such, though.
I wouldn't say all of them do. I would say that it just depends on how one were to define philosophy in the first place. If philosophy itself were just to be a method of thinking, or thinking about thinking in some way, then I do think that there are at least some animals that you could say have one. For instance, you could look at the teleological behavior of cows or pigs or dogs or cats. They have complex behavioral patterns that don't solely seem based completely on just instincts. And to me, that would imply something a little bit more.
I mean, perhaps. I mean, it could well just be that they are able to amend their reactions based on what they perceive at a quicker rate than, say, non-sentient individuals or plants or things like that. But I suppose that's true of human beings as well. Perhaps we just get above ourselves thinking it's all philosophy, though. Perhaps that's all we're doing as well.
True. Evidently we have another question from Shangori. Genetics, or rather changing our own genome, is something that's frowned upon. In a way, this stance is not based on reason or rational arguments. Is it ever possible to overcome the emotions surrounding the idea of changing humanity as a species to accept changes in our genome to further our health and happiness, even if that means to accept that the species Homo sapiens is flawed?
I would think there's quite a lot of hope there. I think it's a taboo, and at the same time, every 100 years or so, if you take a snapshot of the taboos in society, you'll see an ever-decreasing list, or at least an ever-changing list. And there's no reason to believe that any taboo is going to be on that list forever. So I don't see why we couldn't get to a stage where we saw that genetic engineering, even in human beings, would be something of use. At the same time, it raises its own questions of what it is we're trying to do. Why do we want to do that? If it's to eliminate a disease, that makes sense, but if it's to make everyone taller or more attractive, it seems to be a bit bizarre. And then we get into ideas of how tastes change and what exactly are we trying to do. Are we trying to stop society where it is now and stop culture from evolving, or what are we trying to do? But I suppose it brings up its own list of ethical quandaries, whichever way you see it, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, when we look at, for instance, epigenetics and the way that it's currently being used, generally in the medical community, to sort of screw with our genetics in a way so that we can become a little bit healthier and a little bit more satisfied with a longer life and all that kind of stuff. I don't see that being a problem for very long, at least at least as far as public perception goes. One of the things that I think it is the main crux of the matter that was brought up by Shangori was when we accept that our basic makeup, our genetic makeup needs changing. Once we accept that, then we're also necessarily accepting the implication that it's flawed, and there's a lot of people that don't want to accept that just yet. And I don't really see that as lasting for too much longer. I mean, it's not, to me at the very least, it doesn't seem like a very hard to accept premise that we're not perfect. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm just weird like that. I don't know.
Absolutely. I think every time you get a cold, it's kind of obvious. Every time you experience anything where you go, oh, I wish I could do that, it's kind of obvious that we're not quite as perfect as we might think in our moments of success.
Andy?
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'm here. Don't worry about it. So, it's chapter 5 in your book is called Practical Ethics. Would you mind giving a bit of a summarization as to what exactly you mean by the terms practical ethics?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the first 4 chapters, I don't know how it works in length, but originally the first half of the book in those 4 chapters was meant to be putting forth the idea that we spoke about so far of how to ground a rationalist theory of morality in rationality, essentially. How to justify it, how to defend it, how to propose a theory which makes sense and makes a lot more sense than the moral theories we have at the moment. We've got a grounding then to build, which is the subject of my second book, to build a political system and an economic system that works and that is evidence-based. It'll still have its problems, we'll still have our debates, but there's always going to be an evidence-based an evidence base to that. So we can always come back to what the right answer is without bickering. Even if we don't know the right answer, we've got the best evidence on either side. The second half of the book is very much on the practical ethics in our individual lives more than anything. The vast majority is for individual lives anyway. Ideas like, the problems that religion causes, the problems that faith-based dogma causes, the problems that we can encounter in animal ethics that we all kind of ignore because animals aren't as intelligent as us or whatever. Politics, even the chapter on determinism, that's probably one of the more controversial ones. The idea that, it's perhaps a bit philosophical again, but the idea that people aren't necessarily to blame for their actions in the way we like to think they are, and that we should be primarily viewing punishment in terms of rehabilitation or protecting other people rather than a blame-based game of giving someone what they deserve. So it's very much, the second half of the book is very much on the practical side of things, and I think that's important. I think that's if it wasn't for practical ethics, there'd be really no point discussing ethics. That is the bit that relates to the modern world, and whether it's controversial or not, that's a bit that really needs to be spoken about, I think. So, yeah, I think that's the most important part of it.
Yeah, you mentioned your discussion in the book about determinism, and it's different for me. I'm not used to seeing the subject being approached the way you did in the book, but it is an interesting concept because I think it was around the early 1900s, something along those lines, where people started to be a little worried about any sort of growth of the idea of determinism. Why? And the main reason was, well, what are we going to do when we have criminals in court? I mean, all they have to do is say, it's not my fault, I was just born that way, or something along those lines. And you pretty much say, well, we'll do what we usually do. We put them in jail to rehabilitate them rather than to, punish them and say, don't do it again. It's more, you work with it rather than see it as a consequence you'd rather just never address. Because if it is the case that everyone's at the very least basically deterministic, then that doesn't mean that what we do in reference to that can't influence them. In fact, I believe just from the basics of looking at determinism, their experiences based on that outlook do shape them, and we shape their experiences when we put them in court, when we put them in jail, all these different things. And so it's not really something that's all that scary to think about when you actually view it that way. And I thought it was actually a fairly interesting take on the matter.
Yeah, I think that it's important when you're discussing determinism. I mean, we've mentioned this twice already, but it's important to give people a backing of the issue before you start debating what the right thing to do is, because people's natural reaction to determinism is, like you say, in the historical context, it's always going to be, well, we can't punish anyone then. We're all going to be living with criminals, and we're all going to be living with violence in our lives because we can't lock anyone away. Of course, once you say, well, that's not what determinism is, all determinism means is that basically we need to respect people's autonomy and, you know, not punish them for punishment's sake, and instead punish them for a reason, punish them for rehabilitation, or punish them to protect people, take away their freedoms perhaps if we need to. And that the system's largely going to be the same, except it's going to be worked better because we're not just going to be, say if there's a harmless 80-year-old man in jail for something which he couldn't possibly ever do again, and he's not possibly going to be a danger to anyone, the logic's going to say, you know, perhaps we shouldn't have him in jail, perhaps he should be out of jail. Of course, then you've still got other considerations like how are the families of the victims going to feel, or things like that. So it's not a straight case that if the person's not dangerous anymore, we don't lock them up anymore. It's a lot more complex than that, but it's an interesting way to view it. It does put a different spin on things, and I think it's an important thing for people to comprehend as well, just to, if for nothing else, than to show people that even our most deeply held beliefs about blame and ideas like this can be completely wrong. And I think we have to open up all of our beliefs to being a bit more rationally consistent if we're going to get anywhere with society or with morality, with ethics, with anything, really.
Before we end up closing up the show, we had another question as to whether or not you are planning on publishing another book fairly soon.
Yeah, no, I'm working on 2 at the moment. I mean, as I've said, I work a lot on animal ethics. I have a few articles on that subject. So I'm working on a book on animal ethics particularly, which will probably not be of interest to a lot of people. Again, I'll have to do the same thing of disguising the topic, perhaps even this. And the second book I'm working on is more of a building on rational morality slightly. I did briefly mention earlier that once you have a theory of how morality should work and a way of working it and defending it, then on top of that you can build ideas of what is a rational politics and a rational economic system for going forwards, and putting a foundation in place for politics that works and economics that works without all the pointless moral debate that goes on. So that's the book I hope to publish next, but it's still very much in the research stage at the moment.
So, all right. So we'll just have to keep an eye out for both of those then. Let's see. We do have one more question here. In reference to how we would evaluate what to do with criminals, somebody asked how exactly we would determine who would be able to repeat a crime and who, matter of fact, is harmless after the fact. What process would we go through to determine that?
Oh, that's a good question. It's sort of something we already do in society already. Criminologists and psychologists of different kinds already look at how we can determine if someone's going to be dangerous going forward. You know, parole hearings involve hearing what a person's character's like now after they've been in jail for a few years. But it's not an exact science, and obviously we are on the side of caution because we don't want people to get hurt anymore, which is absolutely what we should do. It's just a case of, in a sense, we already do this. It's just a case of improving our understanding of how the brain works, and how people act, why people make the decisions they do, and that's going to be a never-ending process. It's never going to be perfect, but it's the best idea we've got and the best way we've got to go forward.
All right. Let's see. It's almost 3:30 here,
yeah.
And it's almost. It's almost like 8:30 over in UK. So we're going to go ahead and wrap it up there. Again, everybody, the book that we were discussing for at least most of the show is Rational Morality, written by our guest, Mr. Robert Johson. It's called A Science of Right and Wrong. You can see it on Amazon. Zulu linked it a little bit earlier. In the chat log. I assume it'll probably be linked when we put it up on YouTube as well. And I recommend it. It's a very good read, very easy to read for everybody who's willing to pick it up. So thank you again to Mr. Johson for being on our show, our very humble, small podcast.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It was a lot of fun.
So we'll just close out there. Again, big thanks to everyone for turning up. And just as a reminder, our next show is going to be on Friday and not Saturday. So it's the same time, but on the Friday, And our next guest is going to be Robert Schaefer, who is quite a well-known debunker of UFO claims. That's what he specialises in, and he blogs for, I think it's CFI he blogs for. So everyone, please remember, it's on the Friday, not the Saturday for next week. And then 2 weeks after that, we're back on the Saturday with Mr. Matt Dillahunty. So plenty to look forward to. And there's, if you're watching us on the website, up on your right hand side, you'll see our upcoming schedule, and I think everyone will agree there's some really cool stuff coming up. So I'll just go around for the last comments from Mortimer. Your thoughts, please. I know you haven't said much, but
No, I haven't said much. I feel fairly useless in shows like this, but it's fun to listen to people talk philosophy.
Yeah.
I just don't have much to contribute myself.
That is the exact opposite opinion so many people have.
No, I actually think it's fun.
Yeah. Lundy, your last thoughts.
I thought it was. I think this was great. The whole show was great. Lots of great points made. Lots of very good clarifications on as to what's exactly said in the book that I'm recommending to everybody. And again, I recommend it to everybody because it is very good. And I'd just like to thank one more time Mr. Johson for coming on to the show. We really much appreciate it.
Yeah, and Rob, your final words, please.
Yeah, just to say thanks for having me on, really. It was a lot of fun speaking about all this and even going off on tangents. It's quite enjoyable too. So, hopefully I'll be back on one day.
Yep. So everyone, just like I said, I posted the link in the chat there. Go buy the book. I thoroughly recommend it, and Lundy will attest to how, like I say, philosophically illiterate I am. And I'm really engrossed in this book, I have to say. It's like a real proper page turner. I say I've got no comprehension of philosophical ideas, but I'm really enjoying this. So please go buy it. Don't be put off that it's a bit philosophical. It's very easy to access. It's very accessible.
It's actually also fairly science-based. Very philosophy of science. Actually, is done a lot throughout the book. So even if philosophy does turn you off, and you are like so pro-science, anti-philosophy, blah blah blah, you'd still probably enjoy the book. So
I think there's something in this for everyone.
Thanks, guys. The checks are in the post, by the way.
Right, no problem. That's weird. So, yet again, thank you, everyone. If you're listening in podcast land, please drop us an email, contact@throwingawaylogic.com. If there's anything you wanted to ask Rob, we can pass it on afterwards. So, again, thank you very much, and we'll see everyone on Friday. Have a good night. Have a great weekend as well, wherever you are.
Night, everybody.
Yeah.